Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Hello and welcome to the Good Reading Podcast. Phil Barker has more than 25 years of experience in the media. He edited NW and Woman's Day magazines and published such titles as Vogue, GQ, Delicious, Inside Out and Donna Hay. Today I'm talking with Phil Barker about his book Axed, Who Killed Australian Magazines. Phil Barker, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
I'm delighted to be here.
Axed begins with you leaving the Daily Telegraph for a new job on a new magazine at Australian Consolidated Press. What was the attraction to magazines for you and what did you find when you got there?
Well, I left the Murdochs for the Packers, which was interesting in itself. What was interesting to me at the time is that Holt Street, the headquarters of News Corporation, was a fairly male-dominated and, beer rugby league sort of place at the time. And magazines were shiny and glamorous and much more feminine driven as well. And so there was a lot of attractions there.
So what was it like to work in magazines in the 1990s? Who were the main players? Who were the big characters?
Well, the big characters early on in the very early 90s was particularly Nene King, who is a well-known name in magazines. There's lots of huge names, but Nene looms as the queen of magazines. She took Woman's Day from a fusty publication with knitting patterns on the cover to really embracing a great relationship with the royals and particularly Diana. And, there was nowhere else for people to get the news at the time. So the magazines just jumped off the shelves into readers' hands.
This book's full of great quotes. I've got to start with this one. You sound like you were curing cancer when all you were doing was making up bullshit.
You've cut right to the chase. Yeah, that was said to me by a young creative in a creative agency where I worked when I wasn't doing journalism or writing books. Were we making up bullshit? Well, the answer is if there wasn't a photo to substantiate it, very probably. We would do our best to stand things up as much as we could. But in the end, I think there was a sort of an unspoken nod and a wink to readers that as long as the story inside the magazine was as exciting as the cover line, then we'd given them some entertainment. And I think everyone understood that this was about entertainment as much as it was about the truth, because ultimately it was fairly trivial matters about very rich and wealthy people who didn't really notice what was going on.
I want to take you back in time a little bit. Australians were once the leading consumers of magazines in the world, as I understand it.
Yeah, per capita, yes.
When would you say was the golden era of Australian magazines?
The golden era of Australian magazines was definitely the mid to late 90s, with magazines doing, huge numbers. A New Idea and Woman's Day selling, regularly over 1 million copies, and I think the Australian Women's Weekly at 500,000. And if you add in, the advertising, $60,000 a page. And the $3.25 cover price on a weekly basis, they were just absolute licenses to print money, and just utterly huge businesses.
You write about money, but also the way money was wasted. How successful were Australian magazines? Where did all the money go? And finally, what were the opportunities missed in the process? Well,
there was just a real sense that, sure, we knew the internet was coming to get us, but that was someone else's problem in the future. And, when a magazine's making, $10 million clear profit a year, And if you lose 500,000 here or there at a party, or everyone going on a plane somewhere, or hair and makeup coming in for everybody before an event or something like that, well, it didn't really matter. No one noticed. But if a magazine's only making 500,000 a year, and then people start spending that sort of money, then everybody notices. So it was more a function of the huge 30% plus profit margins that the businesses were making. And there was just so much money around that no one really took a close look at the personal expenses of myself and a whole lot of people who are good friends of mine. And it became a real sense of entitlement that we could just get a car to an event, that we would fly here and go there, and sure, there would be business meetings involved, but the bigger decisions were made around the boardroom table, not around lunch. So a lot of those relationships, while they were great fun, they were also questionable in their value, I would suggest.
The more you talk about it, the more I wish I was there.
We didn't realize at the time, but it was a really golden moment in publishing history that's puffed away like so much smoke. And I think that if we'd known at the time that it was going to change so profoundly, that we would have been a lot more careful. A lot of that money that was spent on huge events could have been put away for a rainy day, and some magazines could exist that no longer do.
Talking about big events, what about Women's Weekly turning 70? Tell me about that party.
That was a particularly big moment. I think Kerry Packer just really wanted to congratulate. He loved his magazines. He loved the Weekly particularly. And he just wanted a great big bash. So they had hundreds of people were brought in limousines. The who's who of Australian publishing and media and entertainment. Pavarotti was on the screen congratulating the Weekly on a job well done. I think Mike Munro did a "This Is Your Life" of the Weekly, which is a bit difficult because it couldn't giggle when it saw its old English teacher. But by all accounts, I was not there, I have to say, but I do remember the moment. By all accounts, it was an utterly huge affair. Would have cost well over $1 million to execute, and it was just to go "Happy Birthday Weekly."
Money well spent, I suppose. There are a lot of juicy moments that you talk about, and one phrase that I picked up on was client entertainment. What is that?
That was when we would go out for lunch with a client, say someone senior from Myer or David Jones, or from a media buying planning agency. And basically what you wanted them to do was to put their ads into your magazine. And you talked about how we'd run editorial around the ads to facilitate that happening. The David Jones versus Myer, for example, in the inserted magazine in the Sunday Herald Sun and the Sunday Telegraph, was a multi-million-dollar fight between those two businesses in the late 90s and early 2000s. Just to have the first two right-hand pages was incredibly important to them. And we sort of stood in the middle of that negotiation and made as much money out of it as we could.
Can I suggest that there's a little more to the term client entertainment than what you're giving away?
Oh, I see where you're going. Oh, are you talking about there was a particular moment when there was one or two clients who were making a lot of money and could advertise in the magazine, but they were sort of bordering on the edge of white collar criminal, you might say. And certainly the female sales directors did not want to be sending their female staff to those events. So myself and one of the few male sales guys went. And there was a particular moment I remember that there was young women around us who seemed to think that we were particularly hilarious. And given that we weren't the sort of blokes that attracted throngs of young women who thought we were hilarious, it took us about an hour or two to work out that they were probably paid to be there, and indeed were very high class sex workers. So my friend just asked one of them. He said, "Excuse me," and this is back in the day. So he said, "Excuse me, are you a prostitute?" and this young woman just laughed, and she said, "Of course." Like that, they were stunned that we didn't realize. And the client was quite hurt when we did not avail ourselves of the services that had been paid for. So, but that was sort of rare and unusual. But there was there was the odd client who really did like going to a strip club, and we would happily oblige them and take them on the company dime. And you'd sometimes run into other people there. I actually, hand on my heart, didn't really like that sort of thing. It made me uncomfortable. I look at a poor young woman upside down on a pole and just think to myself, I had a young daughter at the time, and I'd think to myself, oh my God, are you cold? Like, are you okay? Is everything going to be all right? But that was, kind of part of the job, for the blokes especially. Not a huge part. I don't want to insinuate there was a great deal of filth and sin, but on the other hand, there was also a lot of dealers would turn up to lunchtime at the wharf, I can tell you that.
I actually found myself in not quite the same position, but a similar position. And I inquired with the young lady what her profession was, and she said she was in commercial real estate.
Right. Well, I would have just thought she was a real estate agent. So then there you go. Yeah.
Now, there was a lot of trouble embracing the digital world in the 2000s. What was the problem?
I think the main problem was deals that were done very early on before there was a good understanding of digital, especially with Channel 9 and 9MSN and 7 and Pacific did the same thing, in that they outsourced the web component of the brand. And so they just gave away the content and lost control of it. And when it became increasingly important, 9MSN were going, well, no, we need to optimize this content in the way that we want to. And the magazines had no control over their own digital destiny for decades. And it was in those decades that the work should have been done to spread those brands across multiple platforms. It didn't happen, and a lot of people were very frustrated and upset by that because they felt completely hamstrung in their ability to control that content once it had left the editorial office, and it wasn't given the care or the concern that the journos on the editorial floors in Park Street and at Channel 7 and at Pacific magazines might have given it. So that was a real key problem that came to bite magazines really hard in later years.
Now, the foundation of magazines' revenue, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's always been advertising. Another classic quote from your book: "That's not just the patient bleeding money, but hemorrhaging arterial spurts from every orifice like an Ebola victim."
That's something that I wrote after a list over the years for the last 10, 15 years, just showing the drop in advertising year after year after year after year. And it is an utterly horrific view of what happens, no matter which way you look at it. Just the money just bled out of magazines into online, and there was just very little that anyone seemed to be able to or want to do about it.
What do you rank as the most spectacular fails in the magazine industry in that period?
I think towards the end, I think the closures, the multiple closures by the Bowers, especially of magazines like NW that I edited, the mergers of Clio and Dolly to be created by one team, magazines like Men's and Women's Health that were just knocked on the head that were doing really well, that have been resurrected by another publisher that just shows they did have a future. I think there was just a lot of panicking went on, especially around COVID times and the merger of Pacific and Bauer magazines. And I think there are a lot of magazines that are dead, that didn't have to be, but people weren't looking at long-term brand futures. They're just looking at a short-term bottom line. And the answer is, if the widget isn't making money, you stop making the widgets. And magazines are a different thing to that. They have an emotional connection to readers. You mentioned before that we had the highest magazine readership per capita in the world for quite a number of years, and that speaks to like a deep emotional connection that people had with these titles. And it's just sad to see so many of them gone.
What titles have weathered the storm, and how have they come through the storm?
A great example is GQ magazine, one of my favorite magazines. Like I'll still buy an issue of British GQ if I'm going on a plane or something, just because it's just still has such heft and gravitas. It's so well written, it looks so good. It's just a beautiful physical thing. The Australian GQ does not exist in print anymore, yet it is still a very strong and vibrant brand. And I think that's the key for magazines is to understand that you don't exist just as a print platform. You exist as a 24/7, right around the month, surrounding the reader on multiple touch points. And if you think you can sit in an ivory tower and bang out something once a month and just tell readers what they want, well, that's not going to work. It has to be a two-way conversation. I think the understanding of data and what it means and what it tells you about what readers are wanting, I think is really important. So a strong digital play is utterly critical, but it's an all-encompassing brand play that's important. Custom publishers like Medium Rare, who do Coles Magazine and Bunnings Magazine, other titles like that, they understand that incredibly well. Coles has more data about when people are wanting to buy strawberries and what sort of strawberry, recipes people are going to want than magazines ever had. And to be successful, that's where you need to go. And it's interesting, that's exactly what the publisher of Paragon, the business that's picked up men's health and women's health, says. Like he's been around for a long time, worked with Rupert's nephew, Matt Hanbury, the legendary Matt Hanbury back in the day. And he certainly understands what he needs to do to make his magazines work. And he's got magazines about woodworking, about telescopes, and he's got a really lovely little business rolling there with two flagships that Bauer Media didn't want and thought that they couldn't make work.
Niche markets like woodworking, the way of the future?
Premium and niche is a path to success. Like, I'm really interested in guitars, for example. And if I saw a good looking guitar magazine, I would definitely pick that up because it would speak specifically to my niche interests. But your broad lifestyle magazines now, I think really struggle just because it's so easy with the internet to pick up your own specific interest.
It sounds to me like the magazine publishing industry is a litany of errors, mismanagement, lost opportunities, terrible excess, failure to see the signs, and combined with perhaps the reaction times of a sloth. Are these the things responsible for the death of Australian magazines, or is there more to it?
No, that's basically it. It was the 9MSN and Yahoo 7 deals that were the main issue around digital. And then it was really hard to catch up because all the best and brightest minds had gone elsewhere. Bauer Media, who came and bought ACP off the Packers, incredibly successful publishers internationally in Europe, and they absolutely know what they're doing, but they have a model where they repurpose content in multiple markets, and that's just not something that you could do here. They just didn't understand brand. They didn't understand, like, they wanted to use recipes from Australian Gourmet Traveller, you shoot one bowl of green soup and just call it pea soup, call it mint soup, call it whatever. And green soup became a sort of a shorthand for the things that the Bowers were doing. It didn't come from any sort of bad place. It just came from not understanding the market. And I think they did towards the end, but they took an absolute bath after just less than a decade and are out of the market now. So I think their mismanagement and mishandling of magazines, that was a very sad thing for me. So all of those things combined to I don't know if Australian magazines have been killed outright. I think there's actually, after the green soup, there's been a lot of green sheets, and I think people who understand premium and niche understand the value of a good read. T Australia, New York Times Magazine is going from strength to strength here, for example. Rolling Stone has been relaunched. Magazines for rural women are doing incredibly well. There's one that's, I think it's biannual and it costs nearly $30, but it's just packed with gorgeous pictures and stories of women on the land. Farmers aren't men, farms are run by a partnership. And these women finding their voices has been a real boon for magazines. So I think magazines have been taken at the back and giving a thorough kicking, but there's still a place for the people who are doing it right. There's a fantastic story that I really love. As I was researching the book, I remembered working with a guy whose name was Pugsley, and Pugsley was the editor of Live to Ride. It's a biker magazine. It's the only magazine he'd ever worked on. I think he started there when he was 17. And I thought to myself, oh, I better Google, what the hell happened to poor old Live to Ride. Well, nothing's happened to Live to Ride. Pugsley's bought the whole thing off a publisher. He's been doing it for 4 years. He's got, again, he surrounds the reader at multiple touch points. He's got a really good digital offering. He's got a great video offering. And he's made a real success of this thing. He knows what he's doing. He knows who he's talking to. And he's being unbothered by people like myself. I found his number and gave him a ring. I said, mate, it's one of your old crap managers. And he's like, which one? I was just delighted to see that Pugsley had made a go of Live to Ride by doing it the way he wanted it instead of the way that big publishers were making him do it. And he's making a success out of it. It's a great story.
I want to finish with another great quote from your book. Magazines are not commodities. They are emotional touch points in the lives of millions of Australians. Does that still hold true?
Yeah, I think so. I think those people are drifting older, and I think magazines have got a lot of work to do to connect with younger readers. And the publisher of Rolling Stone at the moment, the Bragg Media, are doing a great job with connecting with young people online, not just with Rolling Stone. They've got a number of really powerful properties. So I think that you can make a connection with younger readers, but I think readers are drifting older. But yes, in the heyday, there was just this deep emotional connection between the reader and the magazine that, as media has fractured and the internet has grown in strength, has sort of gone off the boil, but it's still there. And it's interesting. I think, maybe a secondary market for this book, apart from people who've been in this industry or interested in the industry, is also, people who just had a connection with magazines and have seen them shrink and get skinnier over the years, change, and then maybe your favorite magazine has disappeared. And you want to know what the hell happened and why it happened.
Phil Barker, thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Oh, man, thank you for having me on.
I've been talking to Phil Barker about his book, Axed, Who Killed Australian Magazines. It's published by Simon & Schuster, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.